Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our panel this afternoon. My name is Karine Gibbs and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology at UC Berkeley, studying identity in social bacteria. Today, we are going to be discussing how social media and online communication are changing science. And as you may know, this is in celebration of Plant and Microbial Biology, PMB's 30th anniversary. PMB is one of 5 departments in the Rousseau College of Natural Resources. Today's discussion is the third in a series of events and programming, commemorating 3 decades of remarkable contributions to research, teaching, and public service. Like all of you, we also look forward to an in-person event to celebrate PMB's milestone anniversary someday, soon, let's hope, likely in the next year or so. So stay tuned for more. And you're welcome to view our previous talks at pmb.berkeley.edu. Before we continue, I'd like to note that we will be taking live questions in the webinar chat or via YouTube live functions. Also, we are recording this talk and it will be live shortly on YouTube after we end today. So let's jump straight into our discussion after a brief introduction of our panelists who all have strong ties, both current and past, to the PMB department. I'd like to start with Kat Adams. She is, can you wave, Kat? She is a postdoctoral fellow in the glass lab at UC Berkeley on the MCAT phase team, studying the role of that fungi play in the plant rhizosphere. She earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Washington, did her master's at Harvard studying how fungal pathogens of wild chili peppers evolve tolerance to spice, and completed her PhD here at Cal in the Bruns lab studying the chemical ecology of the death cap mushroom. During her PhD, Kat co-founded the Unconscious Bias Project and developed a keynote talk on how scientists can use social media to advance their research careers. Next is Arash Kumali. He is a professor in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology, and he has been on the faculty here at Berkeley for 15 years. His research group studies how bacteria use compartments inside of them to store and transform metals into minerals, such as magnetic particles. And these are used as some bacteria as a primitive compass. Arash believes that social media and digital publishing platforms can have a positive and transformative impact on the practice of science and inclusive and engaging teaching. And last but not least is Cameron Thrash. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Southern California. Cameron is a graduate of the PMB department, where he received his PhD in 2009 under the mentorship of John Coates. His laboratory researches the physiology, ecology, and genomics of heterotrophic marine bacterioplankton. And he's an enthusiastic science Twitter and bioRxiv participant. Welcome, everyone. And so to the audience, there are several domains of newer media that I thought we could focus on today. And today's conversation will really tackle 2 different branches: social media such as TikTok and Twitter, Twitch, and then separately newer science journals and platforms such as some of the preprint services like bioRxiv. And so to frame today's conversation, we're going to focus a little bit on how scientists share information within their communities and beyond, how scientists receive information, and if and how this information exchange shapes and challenges what and how science is done. So my first question to each of the panelists is, briefly, share a bit more about your research and how you use or approach newer communication tools in your research, teaching, and or mentoring, if at all. And Arash, as the most senior person here, I'd like you to start.
Yeah, just as you were going through my bio, I realized I guess I've been faculty for half of the lifetime of PMB. So it's really wonderful to participate in this celebration of a department that's really means a lot to me. And I hope to a lot of the people who are tuning in, it means the same to them. So I guess the general question is how I think social media could be used for kind of furthering the research goals of my lab and some of my teaching. And generally, I guess I kind of got into using Twitter more as a personal account, just as a way of communicating with people that I knew. And as I kind of grew into the experience, I noticed that a lot of the people that were my Twitter followers, or I was following them, were also scientists. And then I saw how they were using it to promote, let's say, papers from their labs or to organize at large conferences. And that sort of became something that I did in addition to all the other ways that I use Twitter. So it's really turned into a virtual community of scientists in a way that I might walk around Koshland Hall when we are on campus and able to use Koshland Hall socially to see people and talk to them and see, hey, what's the latest thing that's happening, in your lab? What's research are you working on? What papers are you working on? And that's sort of the way that I've been using it. And it's happened to also be very beneficial for me personally in my growth as a scientist. I see how other people are using new media to teach in their classes. And at times also I've used Twitter in a way to engage students and reach out to this sort of larger community that's there that can kind of give us feedback on what we're doing. I know it's very general, so I'm happy to get into the specifics later, but I'll give the other panelists a chance to also talk about their experiences.
Well, I can go, sure. Okay, so I am a huge fan of Twitter, and I love it for lots of reasons. You can follow along at conferences that you can attend. It's great for finding scientific papers and for asking questions about papers and research protocols. So actually just last week, I was trying to decide on which dye I should use to dye live fungal tissue. And the myco Twitter or fungus Twitter community was immensely helpful at generating suggestions with both advantages and disadvantages. And eventually, I also really hope to use the live streaming website twitch.tv to stream lab work and show viewers what everyday life is like for a scientist. So as you mentioned, my PhD was on the death cap mushroom Amanita phalloides, and it is a deadly poisonous mushroom that's also an invasive species introduced here from Europe. And so I was curious, and I started a small project on the platform iNaturalist, which is a really great website where people can post observations of things they find out in nature. And I made this project to collect data on whether or not the mushrooms in California have less insect damage than mushrooms in the species' native range of Europe. So it's the sort of thing that if you wanted to contribute, you could just find it if you Google Amanita insect damage within the iNaturalist site. And I'll also add that we used iNaturalist while teaching California mushrooms with my advisor, Tom Bruns. And it is a great way for students to post the unknown mushrooms that they find and to get faster feedback from the entire iNaturalist community compared to just us instructors working alone. So yeah, I'm a big fan of social media for research and teaching.
And Cameron, why don't you finish this off?
Sure. Well, I basically use Twitter pretty much exclusively as a social media platform, and I really only use it for scientific purposes, for scientific community, for communication and interaction, either in sharing papers or live tweeting conferences or talks that I'm viewing myself. But also for participating in various conversations with colleagues. And like Kat said, I also use it for asking questions about things like best practices and protocols, what to do if your -80 freezer is broken from a computer glitch, and who else is having that problem, other things like that, which those of you who follow me know we were dealing with last week. This all began for me as a semi-paranoid hope to survey literature and opinions about research papers, and it's transformed into something of a long-standing community service project for sharing the literature. But it's also simultaneously really for providing as large an audience as possible with which to promote my lab's research activities, which is valuable, not just for me, but more importantly for trainees in my lab at all levels. So from undergraduate researchers who we have on papers all the way up to postdocs. And so I see it as a sort of a give-take mechanism, both in terms of how we interact with the community, but also how we can provide a service to the community as well. I've used Twitter in the classroom in some cases. We used it as a way to connect students with experts because it is a really fascinating way to get a hold of people that is sometimes hard to do from cold emails or cold calls. And we've also used it as a platform in the classroom to show students how to live tweet presentations and kind of see how that can be used as an information propagation service. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to questions and diving in more deeply.
Thank you. I heard some common themes of Twitter, especially being an extension of your local communities and allowing you to interact with scientists, not just who are next door or necessarily around the water cooler, but who could be anywhere across the world. But I imagine that leads to some vulnerabilities, that it can be a little unusual. I know for myself personally, I find it a little awkward sometimes to be on Twitter with people I've never met in person. Would any of you be willing to talk a little bit about your experiences there and how you have either approached it or how you think that it might change your interactions with your own students or with your own science?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I would say is that there's a variety of ways of engaging with Twitter, right? So it is, even though it's a social media, it's different than actual social interaction. You could actually be an observer. So you could decide that all I want to do is just listen to what people are saying and learn from listening to their discussions. So there might be uncomfortable topics where I feel like I want to learn more, things that I haven't personally experienced and things that in my normal day-to-day interactions around the building people wouldn't talk about. But there's enough people in this minority who've experienced something who start a conversation and talk about it, and we can sit there and listen to it, and even though it's uncomfortable, we can learn from it and, like, let's say, change our mentorship practices and see that some students might want something different from you as a mentor versus others, right? And that is something that's very difficult to come by through just the normal everyday interactions that we get within a sphere where we know each other really well. You almost kind of need to have a distance and not know each other well to be able to sort of open up and share about some of those experiences. So in the sense of something being difficult and, you know, expecting vulnerability out of an interaction, I think it makes it actually easier on social media to do that. And it makes it easier for you to not feel like you have to engage or provide a solution and just sit there and learn.
So I think I sort of grew up during the heyday of MSN Messenger and AOL Instant Messenger, and I made friends online that I'm still friends with 15 years later. And so for me, I don't really like classify them very differently in my IRL, my in real life friends and my internet friends. Like I can be just as close with people if I choose to, people that I've only met online. But I think it's an interesting question. And I think online, more so than in person, you can sort of choose the community that you want to engage in. I can choose who I want to follow on Twitter. I can choose, who I'm friends with on Facebook and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a lot about who you choose and who you choose to be vulnerable with. And I tend to go the more vulnerable route on Twitter, sharing things, sharing my struggles and all that. But to each their own, right? Like you get what you put into it for sure.
I kind of take the opposite approach. I very rarely get into anything personal. You'll never find any pictures of my family or anything like that. I think, especially as the follower count has gone up for me, I've become much more sensitive to the possibility for abuse and for information being manipulated, or I don't know, the audience being so far beyond imagination that I have no idea who's actually listening at this point. And I've seen a lot of people with a lot of abuse on Twitter because they were voicing their opinions, and so I've become very reticent about revealing my personal thoughts on a lot of matters, just to avoid those kinds of conflicts, frankly. So I'm immersed in the social media aspect of science, but I do spend a lot more time listening, like Arash was saying, than talking about, at least about how I feel and about my personal opinions, because mostly just sort of play it safe and just protect myself, frankly. I'm just a little nervous, even after many years of using this platform. I'm maybe more nervous now than before about setting off a firestorm.
Cameron, if I can keep this on you for just a little bit, then let's talk a little bit about how you are able to then help raise the profile of your students. That same worry of your own necessarily personal information being out there. I think on the flip side, you do a really wonderful job of highlighting all of these up and coming students and postdocs and graduate students that you interact with. So can you tell us a little bit about your approach there?
Yeah, well, it's mostly just highlighting, for the most part, it's highlighting papers, and then when I'm at conferences or live talks and live tweeting those to the degree that I'm capable of it, or not feeling burned out. And I think really, at least my feed is, I think the expectation is that that's a place where you can go to find papers and find information about the literature and things like that. And so I think maybe to some degree there's a little bit of a brand there, not in terms of what we do necessarily, but what type of information is going to be on that handle feed. It's me exclusively. I don't have anybody doing anything for me. I'm not a bot. I've heard some conspiracy theories, but it really is just me. But to the degree that it is, that I have kept it sort of thematically simple and focused, I think that's why people follow me, is to get that kind of information. And so I think that helps a lot, is to have sort of a simple focus like that.
Yeah, and I would follow up with just a simple statement that there's no one way to do social media, and I really think that people should do whatever works for them, whether that's being really private or being more open, and there's risks and benefits for both. So yeah,
certainly agree. There's as many ways as people, for sure. Good point.
Yes, and so for both Kat and Cameron, then I'm going to push you a little bit further. So Kat, one of the things that you've talked about is having this interaction with people through iNaturalist, where the community can actually reach out for help from you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think that's been expanded or constrained in the time that you've been using either social media or the preprint servers?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, I remember when iNaturalist was really new. I remember seeing it at a conference and thinking, oh, that's so cool. We can post observations of fungi and insects and animals and all these things. And it's only grown in popularity. And so there's more and more posts. The sort of AI for automatically identifying things has gotten better. It's still not great for mushrooms. So just a heads up, be careful. Don't believe it per se on mushrooms. But yeah, it's gotten a whole lot bigger and a lot more useful. And so the more people that are using something like that, the more data you can generate about whether it's like a species distribution or, like collecting actual data, like the Amanita project I mentioned. And yeah, as far as the preprint servers go, I think they've also, with time, just gained in popularity and consequently in utility. The more people that are using it, the more normalized it is for people to post preprints, the better, the more people that can get more out of it. So yeah.
So, and Arash, how about yourself? Do you feel that you have, what are your thoughts about the interactions or that you've been able to have with the greater public or with scientists outside of PMB, either through preprints or through social media? And again, the same question of branding. Do you feel that there's a brand to your work?
You mean like a brand to my social media
handle? Exactly. For your...
I think I'm pretty boring on social media. So I feel like if I wasn't a professor, I probably would have like a quarter of the followers or something. No, I don't know. No, there's no real brand, and I try to learn from other people. So and kind of get inspired by who like Cameron is being very modest here in terms of like the brand of his Twitter feed. But I do remember being at like a large conference, and he wasn't just live tweeting a talk. He was live tweeting it. And his excitement about what he was seeing was coming through in the Twitter feed, which made me just want to, like, later on, I saw people who were at the talk. I wanted to learn more about this topic that I hadn't thought about. This is like one of the struggles we have if we go to a very large conference. Microbiology is such a giant field, right? I'll be lucky if I can see half of the talks that are somewhat related to my specialized topic, right? So to hear about the other things from people that I know who are excited about it, and then maybe later on we talk about it, or even right then I might decide this seems more interesting than the talk that I'm in. Let me go see what's going on in this other session. So there's a way that even if you want to stick to just, strictly business, that you can actually have that come through. So for me, for example, I love hearing when colleagues have accomplishments or something's happened. So maybe like a big part of my feed is just me replying with a congratulations to someone who's won an award or a paper that's come out or something like that. And that, to me, that's just how I would be if I had the chance, or if I'm lucky enough to be able to see those people all the time, and I don't. And so this is a good way to extend it. And in terms of like career, I try to use it to sort of promote papers I've learned from other people. I really, the first couple of times that I saw someone have a paper published and then they had a Twitter thread where they described the paper, maybe even they described like how they went about getting into studying that topic, why it's significant, something that may not come through if someone out of the field starts reading our paper. They may not know all the history of it. And so using that as a way of both highlighting the people who worked on the topic and then saying something small about this topic that we worked on in the lab, I really like doing that. And I also started using it at conferences, for example, to just have like a thread where I highlight where everybody is at this conference from my lab and what they're doing. So here are these people at these posters. If you want to learn about this topic, go to this poster. This person's giving a talk at this time. And, like for the duration of the conference, maybe make that a sticky on my Twitter. So anybody who goes to my page can see that. And so that's like a professional way of using Twitter. For me, like I like that Kat went to like sort of originally how she got into maybe using social media. And for me, in terms of science, it's not really social media. But when I first started at Berkeley, I had a lot of colleagues to turn to for advice. But I think, as a lot of you might relate to this, you get different, almost sometimes completely opposite pieces of advice from different people, because people do science differently. Maybe they balance writing papers versus writing grants differently. Something's worked for one person that hasn't worked for the other person. And so I started kind of just searching online to see what do other people think. If, should I just be limited to the 5 or 10 people that I interact with here at Berkeley? And I started finding a lot of science blogs where people talk about their day-to-day work, or they talk about their approaches to writing grants, what's worked, what hasn't worked. So professionally, it was actually really useful to have access to this larger community. And then that's kind of carried on through Twitter, where people might post, a grant that they've written, or their approach to writing grants, or here's a difficulty I've run into mentoring a student. Does anybody have any ideas? And I just might read that thread and learn something. And that kind of helps me professionally, right? And it's very random on Twitter, right? It's whatever pops up at you if you happen to be engaged. And so for a more organized way, I really recently enjoyed using Slack as a way of organizing communities. And there's, for example, like I'm on a Slack for mid-career PIs that has members from all around the world. And that's been incredible because we're all at about the same career stage at different institutes with different rules and regulations, but a lot of common career objectives and problems. And it's just wonderful to pop in, ask a question, or hear from other people how they might handle a situation. There's no way I would have had that level of sort of community feedback and resources if I just stuck to Berkeley as my place to get advice and mentorship. Yeah.
So on the topic of branding, I feel like I have less of a brand and more of a theme with my Sciences medal. And so the idea when I started it is that I love metal music, and there's a lot about science that is sort of hardcore, if you will. And so I had fun, like writing my silly blog, Sciences medal, and that's like my Twitch handle, Sciences medal. But what I think is advantageous about having a theme like that is you can sort of tap into communities that are already there. And so one of the things that I really want to do on Twitch, once COVID's over, once we all get our vaccine and things go sort of back to normal, is bring guest scientists on my channel to play video games and talk about their science, right? So it started out as a video game streaming website. So why not sort of combine the two? Because we would have this community of people who are already really into video games who might also be interested in science. and get to, talk to scientists through the chat. Definitely have some moderators, that sort of thing, but I think it would be a lot of fun. So there's a lot you can do with branding and themes like that. Yeah, I just want to reiterate one thing that Arash said too. This idea of community is just so much bigger now with the internet and with all these fun, great people I've met at conferences that I'm able to keep in touch with over Twitter and Facebook and that sort of thing, who I wouldn't otherwise probably have regular contact with. Is really great. And especially during the pandemic, I've really appreciated social media and the amount that it's able to connect people.
So as I get ready to ask the next question, I just want to invite our audience to add questions either to the question answers in Zoom or to YouTube. We're monitoring both channels. But both Kat and Arash really led to this idea of why are we using these media, these newer tools. And for myself, I think that there is something to hearing perspectives from different people with different backgrounds and different experiences. And I think that it is a way for people to connect and not necessarily feel as alone. At the same time, I can imagine that for some people, it can be isolating. And so, Cameron, would you tell us a little bit more about what led you to begin using these newer communication tools, and where do you think you'd take it next if the sky's the limit?
Sure. I started in my postdoc, and it was really an attempt to try to, well, at least with Twitter, to try and see what the chatter was out there about various pieces of the literature. I was very nervous about moving into a new field and wanting to make sure that I was using as many antennae as possible to capture literature that might be going by. And then I also realized that that's a two-way street. You can receive information, but you can also put it out there. And if you have the right community network, that can be really helpful to getting your papers seen by more people and start engaging in conversations about all kinds of things. And so that's kind of how I got started. I think in terms of where it's all going, we've been spitballing about this, but I think about communication from the standpoint of efficiency sometimes. And one of the things that I've certainly come to appreciate recently is that there's absolutely no way to stay on top of the literature. There's so many papers. I survey papers every day, and there are dozens of papers relevant to the research in my lab that come out every day. And if we all had to read dozens of papers per day, there'd be very little time left for anything else. And so I started to wonder a bit about what are the most effective ways to communicate science. And I think one of the things that's interesting to explore mentally is whether we might be able to move beyond paper and pen or writing and reading to more effective forms of communication. I know Arash has brought up this idea of having conversations and just talking to people about their science as one of his preferred ways. I'll let him elaborate on that. But I think that humans have evolved to communicate by talking to each other, not by writing and reading. Writing and reading is slow. And so, one of the things that Kat's also brought up is this idea of Twitch and having virtual experiences. And so I wonder if as bandwidth increases and we get into things like holographics and things, that whether social media starts to become just a social, like a virtual presence, and that you could potentially witness science. Hundreds of people could witness science as it's happening and maybe interact with the researchers while they're doing it, as a way of actually communicating the science directly instead of having to write it down. Obviously, you're going to want to archive it in some way. There's going to want to be ways to review it and do these types of things that are nicely packaged in paper formats right now. But I just wonder, maybe that's part of where we're going with some of this, is that it won't just be words that we're reading that people are spitting out anymore. It might be virtual communities in person, so to speak.
So a little bit like Jim Carrey in the Truman Show, having live feedback with cameras. I know that's not what you mean, Cameron, but I think that's interesting, this idea of real-time dynamic and exchange. Kat or Arash, do you want to speak on this before we go to our first question from the audience?
Not really, but as we were preparing for this, this idea of cats is just stuck with me a lot. This whole Twitch thing, and also the idea of kind of having like a video abstract, or not like a very stiff and formal talk, but like a way that if we are so excited about the work that we do, and often the trainees who do most of the work, sure, they get the practice writing the paper, but I really like this idea that Cameron has of giving them the chance to just kind of describe it as they're excited about it, and it doesn't have to be formal or stiff, but it still can have like deep content. And so but this Twitch thing to me was like really, really cool. This idea that, obviously you can't do it all the time, but this idea of seeing science, the practice of science, how it's working in the lab, I think is a really neat idea. Yeah, I'll come on your show, Ken.
Awesome. What game would you play? Do you have a favorite video game?
I have one game that I like, and that's FIFA. So it's a soccer game. So
all right,
it's the only game I'll play.
Deal. Yeah, that makes me glad to hear that, because I think practically some sort of live streaming is useful, like Cameron said, not like practically. So there's a Jove for EcoFab production. So this little, it's a cast device for putting your favorite plant in this little chamber with your favorite microbes, and you can torture them to your heart's content and understand a whole lot about them. But the actual process of making an EcoFab is pretty detailed, and there's a lot in this Jove that other people made, but I think it might be really helpful if I showed other people, through a video, exactly how we go through this process. And it's the sort of thing that we really want other people to use this EcoFab to study the microbiome, and anything that I can do to make that easier, is really cool, not just for showing everyday, showing the public what it's like to be a scientist, but also for showing other scientists why they should use this really cool tool. So I think there's a whole lot that could be done along similar lines with something like Twitch or YouTube or the like. So yeah, I'm all for it.
And showing all the failure that goes into science, like you do your best and like the result is not that great. And for people to be able to see that, and maybe even see the process we go through to kind of troubleshoot an experiment idea. Oh, here, here's this thing that I'm disappointed because it looks this way. This is what I would do next. I think that is really great. And there's different audiences I think it would be appropriate for, but I'm really thinking, like, for example, just because I do teach undergrads, I think undergrads would really love to see that more. Maybe before they've gotten a chance to really work in the lab, to just sort of see what it's like, and maybe it'll make it a little bit less intimidating.
I agree, and like Arash Cat, I also have been thinking about this, and I liked it from two different perspectives. One is of having your favorite scientist play a video game, and so if you had one get for someone to come on your show, who would that be?
I mean, Jennifer Doudna is a PI on the project I'm on. She just won the Nobel Prize. I think it would be fantastic to have her playing Super Mario or any game, right? And talking about her path to the Nobel Prize. Like, how cool would that be?
Jennifer, we're going to ask you to come join us one day. So let's turn now to a few questions from the audience. And panelists, please feel free to jump in. And if no one volunteers, I will call on you randomly, popcorning it around. So first question was, how do you feel about controlling the narrative when presenting to an audience when someone's live tweeting? And specifically what I mean by that is that we are at this generational shift where someone recording what you are saying in a private talk is now made public when they write down what they see on their Twitter accounts. And so some organizations like the Gordon conferences have asked people not to do that, to retain the privacy of unpublished data and encourage people to share things. And other organizations have looser rules, and I think that schools don't necessarily define that. So fundamentally, the question is, how do you feel about this? And do you feel that you've now lost control? And how do you gain it back of your own narrative and really your research narrative?
I'm sure this partly depends on the field that you're in and how collegial people are in this field in terms of how much you would worry about sharing data, things like that. I'm probably on the more on the side of I'd rather things be shared openly rather than hold off and wait for 4 or 5 years before we can publish it. So I'm not going to probably be talking about something that isn't, we're not confident enough about it. So that, it's pretty much like we made substantial headway down a project before I would talk about it. And so maybe I'm not so worried that someone's going to scoop us. If a trainee really felt like they were worried about it and they didn't want to, and we would talk about it. And if they really felt strongly they wouldn't want to share the project, I wouldn't do it. But I love Gordon conferences. I think they should get rid of that rule. Honestly, I don't think people would share less about what they do if I feel like it was maybe a reaction to the early days of social media. It really doesn't reflect how people communicate science nowadays.
Can I push back just a little bit? So instead of unpublished data, what if someone is misrepresenting what you're saying? And so they're taking the content, but not necessarily conveying the actual conclusions, right? So they've taken their own spin on it. How have you experienced that? And not just Arash, anyone can speak on this. Have you yourself experienced that? And if you haven't, how do you imagine that you would respond to it, or is there a response to it?
Yeah, I let other people answer, but I haven't experienced that. I guess my feeling would be if they're not allowed to tweet about it, they might be misrepresenting it in a forum where I don't even know that they're talking about it. But if they're talking about it on Twitter and using my name, then I have a chance to maybe say, oh, no, wait a minute, I think you got this detail wrong, or let me correct it.
Yeah, I agree. I would rather it be public in a way where I could offer suggestions and corrections. And I'm a fan of the sort of let each individual choose whether or not they want their stuff tweeted about. And so like at the last MSA conference, there's basically like a Twitter symbol with a red dash through it. And if someone puts that on their poster or on their slides, that's just an indicator that they're at a stage where they don't want it shared for whatever reason, right? And that's up to them to decide. But yeah, I feel like it's sort of like, any publicity is good publicity when it comes to your science. If people are talking about it, then they're more likely to remember it when they're going to cite it and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm aware of the fact though that people are definitely informational filters. And so whatever I present is going to be interpreted differently by each of you, right? And that isn't something I can control. That's just how people are, right? Everybody's different. Everybody has different contexts that they process things with. But if it's in a public forum, you can at least have a conversation about it if you do feel like someone has gotten it incredibly wrong for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'll third that sentiment, and I also agree with Arash about getting rid of this no tweet thing. I don't personally see any difference between someone's ability to tweet information and their ability to talk about it. And so if you're saying I don't want you to tweet about it, to me that's akin to saying I don't want you to talk about it either. So I kind of consider this to be maybe, I don't know. I don't see how you're going to restrict the flow of information. I think there's also something we need to discuss here about accessibility to information. Getting into conferences is expensive. Going and seeing these things is expensive, and sometimes it's exclusive, and we don't necessarily know what the rules are. Gordon conferences are an example of this. You have to apply, and you don't necessarily know what the criteria are that allowed you to participate in this thing. And so I think that, especially as we're considering broader initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the things to keep in mind are these barriers to information access. And this no tweet policy is an example of keeping information exclusively among people who can afford to get into these things. Or who are part of a pre-designated community of people. And so I'm just generally not a fan of that approach, full stop. If you feel like your information is vulnerable enough that you need to protect it, it's probably, my philosophy is it's not time to be giving talks on that type of thing. So I think that's where I stand on those issues.
So I'm hearing a resounding appreciation for an openness towards science. And I think that that is part of what's driving this idea of having a preprint server, places where you can put data first, and then as it's going either through a peer review process or to be community moderated. But one of the questions that came in was, what are your thoughts on the non-moderated aspects of these digital platforms? Right, so we can already see in some of the articles that have been published on bioRxiv in about COVID-19, you can see a really rapid exchange in the community online, either in Twitter or in the comments in bioRxiv about the data itself. But we've also seen situations where, and unfortunately, I think this often happens to women and people who are of cultural minorities, where they can be bullied online or targeted. And so, these are really, I think, places that can lead to fear or resistance in adopting these digital platforms. What are your thoughts on how we can approach this non-moderation? Is there a way for the community to have a discussion about that? And is this something that is broader than just the scientific community? So, and again, anybody is welcome to jump in. Cameron, go ahead, Arash.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I think it's a difficult question. I guess, as people, like, let's say in my position, you sort of like, there has to be some level of self-moderation. I actually see a question from Maria later that maybe relates to this as well, that you want to, for example, I think like people who are faculty could probably take a more active role of standing up when something is happening where someone's getting bullied, to protect people in those cases. I'm not sure if I've done the best job of this, but I should, and also to kind of, even if I'm not stepping in, I will try to kind of amplify the voices of people as they're talking about some of these topics. But yeah, the moderation part, it's hard for me to answer because the benefits of the platform, there are some basic rules in place for what you can and can't say on Twitter. I don't know how well they're enforced all the time, but there are some basic rules, and beyond that, I think over moderation is going to probably have more detrimental effect on the communication benefits that you get. So I guess self-moderation is what I would try to emphasize.
I'm going to also, or actually also said in addition to self-moderation, though, is that those of us who are in positions of I don't want to call it power, but of where we are people who are looked up in the community or in positions that are a bit more stable need to be active allies. If we want to participate. It's one of the things I hear coming out of your themes. Is that correct? I don't want to misrepresent you.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And if there are cases where we have done something wrong, I mean, that I don't think there's no real detriment to you to just come out and say, I'm sorry, I did this thing, it wasn't great, I apologize, right? Try to you make up for it or something like that. So just, I think being able to realize that, okay, as a professor, if I'm walking down the hallway, again, using caution as an example, and I talk to a graduate student, and I'm fortunate enough to know a lot of the graduate students because I teach them also, I'm trying to be mindful that it's not just a casual social interaction. I'm still a faculty member, and no matter how many times we've talked before, there is a power differential there, and it's really no different on Twitter, the way that I'm approaching it. If I'm going to write something or reply something, I am mindful of who I'm talking to, partly. Yeah.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and I have so many thoughts, so I'll just tell you a couple highlights. Just that I think, so for one, we know that there's data that people from like non-Western countries, like women and or people of color, like get more flack during the peer review process. And I would not be surprised at all whatsoever if that were true on like bioRxiv as well, right? And so what we did with Unconscious Bias Project, which I left in great hands, go check them out, unconsciousbiasproject.org, was teach people not only about being aware of your own biases and reducing your biases and whatnot, but bystander intervention, and whether that's in person or online, like you can still be that person that's like, oh, hey, I think you're being a little too harsh, or whatever the appropriate comment is to help mitigate some of that. And so I think being aware just that, like Arash said, there's these power dynamics, there's all sorts of different interactions happening, but that we don't have to just sit idly by and watch them occur. We can definitely intervene. And I encourage everyone to read up on how to do that safely and, in a way that resonates with whatever your personal approach is. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now and let Cameron talk too.
I don't have a whole lot to add on this other than Twitter is well, at least Twitter, I stay away from all social media except for that. And part of it is because of just there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of things that happen that I find to be less than useful. Twitter, I think the benefits do outweigh the costs, but I think one of the things that this kind of comes with the territory in the sense that there can be a lot of negativity and bullying that happens in that space, and it's not totally easy to figure out how to manage that. I like the idea of intervention, and that also comes with the cost of redirecting those attacks to yourself. And so there's no consequences on Twitter for being a horrible person, really. And so I think that's one of the things that's really, well, it's definitely motivated me to mind my P's and Q's, but it has also motivated me to be pretty reclusive from a personal standpoint. And so I think to some degree, I don't. Everybody's kind of got to take that risk as they move into that space a little bit, but it would be helpful if there were more people of authority that got involved when there was obvious abuse. I think you do see that from time to time. There's definitely cases that I've witnessed where you will see a cadre of people form a defense, but it also has to do with whether or not people are even aware that it's happening, right? Like Arash said earlier, it's kind of random. It's like what you see what if you don't check Twitter for a week? A whole thing could have happened and you weren't there. So it's there's things like that limit the effectiveness. But if you are around, I think it's definitely worth it to call attention to things that are negative to help people that are being bullied.
So to speak on this a little bit, I think that there is more than ample research about the challenges of newer media on social media with racial, cultural differences. And I encourage everyone in the audience to look that up if you're interested in it. One of the things, though, that is really striking to me in this conversation is that though, as Cameron said, in some ways we don't see any consequences, I think that when we're talking about science Twitter, my observation is that people tend to be talking to people that they know, right? And so the in real life and online are not fully separate from each other. There's some intermingling of them. And so one of the questions from the audience is, how do you figure out what your own boundaries are? And we've really heard from Cameron that he prefers to have professional versus personal. And I think that's wonderful. And that Kat kind of blends them a little bit closer together, but very much in her own interests. So do you have a set of topics that you would not comment on, Kat, or interact with for the sake of remaining on your streamline of topics for your own, Twitter or Twitch? Choose your favorite online stream. And then, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a really great question. So I found it to be really beneficial to talk about some private things. In particular, the sort of private thing that is not so private anymore is that I spent several years being really, really sick from post-viral fatigue. And it's the sort of thing where they don't know exactly what caused it. I mean, they know they know a virus caused it. Like I caught mono at a conference essentially. But then they didn't know like how to fix it. And like, I didn't know anyone around me with this, but I found this wonderful community, the No End in Sight Void, the NEIS Void, hashtag NEIS Void on Twitter, of other people with chronic illness who just help each other figure out like, all right, I've got this weird symptom, like who else has got it? Like what helps with it? Because my doctor has no idea. And that's the sort of thing that I think Twitter or social media can make a community that isn't really possible to have in real life, simply because the isolating nature of chronic illness, where people don't have the energy to go to a group meeting and that sort of thing. So because I think I had this benefit where I got a whole lot out of social media for something really private, that really influenced how open I was on social media and tweeting about that sort of thing. And I think it gives visibility, especially with long COVID now. People are talking a lot about the overlap between post-viral fatigue and long COVID and that sort of thing. And I see it in a lot of the groups I still follow. That deserves more attention, right? And so I'm glad I talked about it, because it's definitely coming into the news a lot more. But again, I think it really just depends on you. Like, some people are just intrinsically more private, right? And I'm just an open book. Like, that's just how I move through the world. I just overshare everything. So I really don't want to pressure anybody in that respect, but I will say that you can get a lot out of being, sharing semi-private things sometimes on social media when it brings you into a community that you wouldn't otherwise have access to.
Yeah, I can actually, I have said that I'm pretty reclusive now, but there have been times in the past when I've mentioned some things that were sort of like frustrations or personal issues. And I actually found Twitter to be incredibly supportive, but that's partially because of the community that's there. And so it can be a place where you can get a lot of help and a lot of support if you're willing to interact with those types of people. And this, I've also been thinking since Kat was talking, I said that, there's no consequences to being a bad person on Twitter, but that's not really true, right? I mean, it's true for some people. So it's true for like people who want to be anonymous. There are people who can get away with being a bad person on Twitter, and those people can attack people and get away with it. On the flip side, those of us who are out there and are real people, and know how to get a hold of us, and our reputations are on the line, there are significant consequences to being a bad person, but there's significant consequences to being a good person too, because people know who you are and they see you being supportive and they see you standing up for people. And so, I know a lot of people that I follow on Twitter because I watch how they support other folks, and I like their messages and their affirmations, and there are some really, I want to come back around and basically say that there are some really wonderful things that happen when people are more open and willing to sort of take the risks that allow a community to form in a genuine way.
Well, with the last few minutes that we have here, I want to get to one more audience question. And I think this is a good way to actually wrap it back into our larger community here at Planet Microbial Biology. And the audience member asks, in your opinion, whose responsibility is it to communicate research effectively? And I think that's also true for teaching and mentoring. And really where I'd like you to put some focus on is not just to communicate research effectively now, but in the next 5 years, and as best as we can think, in the next 10.
It's a good question. I think we tell our undergrads a lot of times that they're going to be part of and if any of my undergrads are watching this, they're going to roll their eyes probably because I've said this multiple times, but they're part of a very small group of people in the world who are going to have a really in-depth science education. And a lot of them are doing that to kind of prepare for the next stage of their career, whatever it is, go to like some sort of like a health career or continue in research. But probably more impactful in their lives are all the interactions that they will have. We're talking about social media and having interactions. And so they are part of like this very small group of people that potentially can understand some depth of science, in our case, biology, for example. And if they can also communicate it effectively, then they can actually have a pretty big impact. It could be within their very small sphere of friends and family, or it could be larger, if they're interacting with patients or otherwise. And so that means that, not only you have to understand science, you have to understand who you're talking to understand how to take something that's detailed and complicated, filter it, and then discuss that with other people. And as scientists, for example, in my lab, I feel like everybody in my lab has a responsibility to be able to communicate their science effectively. And a lot of my students participate, or all of them participate in outreach activities. So they might be talking to a group of fifth graders, or they might be talking to students at a community college, and they have to be able to talk about what they do in a way that is effective to all those different audiences. So I think all of us who are engaged in it, and even if we don't do hands-on research, or we're learning about science and research, we all have a responsibility to be able to communicate it effectively.
Kat or Cameron, do you have any additional statements?
Yeah, so as someone who's done a little bit of science journalism, so I've written for Slate and BBC Earth mostly, it's really hard. So it's really hard. And even with the little bit of training I've had to do science journalism, like I still messed up a couple things, right? Like I got a correction on one of my articles for mixing up, it was speed and acceleration or something like that. But I think it's a career unto itself to do science communication, but I think that scientists should be better about helping the science journalists. That's sort of my combo answer, is I think ultimately the people who get paid and who have the training and the resources to do that, like, should probably drive it. But I think that scientists also have a lot of responsibility, because we understand things, like Arash said, to the degree that we do, to help those who have the communication skills to get that science out there.
And I would add to that, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is that I think that as scientists, and I think that the Planet Microbial Biology community has been doing this, is to try and reach people where they're at, right? And so it's really important, I think, to make sure that we are expanding and sharing what we do know and what we don't, and also talking about the things that we don't know and don't understand in communities beyond just our own labs, but in, whether it's your local schools or your churches, if you go to, or your religious organizations, or in your families. And that's become, I think, more and more apparent as we have spent the last 9 months inside in our homes with our families. So in the last 2 minutes, I just want to open the floor to each of you for you to share any last thoughts that you have about science communication, about where you're hoping that the newer media will take your research or your interactions with the larger community. Cameron, why don't we start with you?
Well, I didn't prepare for this one, Karine, so I'm not sure I have a great perspective on this. But
I'm keeping you on your toes, Cameron.
Yeah, I think in terms of where I hope this will go is I hope it continues continues to open doors for people to have access to science that don't have it easily right now, that don't get into the top universities, or that maybe don't know about certain fields, and are suddenly they're interested in doing the work, but they don't know who's doing it. I think one of the things that's hardest to do when you're not in the world of science is figure out who's doing what and where. And even if you're really paying attention to it, I know students trying to apply to grad school sometimes really struggle to find professors that are doing the types of things that they're interested in, because they don't necessarily know where to look, or they don't have access to the right literature because it's behind a paywall, or all kinds of reasons. And so I just hope that that's really what Twitter and other social media platforms continue to do, is to provide an access points to science for people that want to get there and want to get involved and help us expand who is in this enterprise of generating new knowledge.
Man, I want to agree wholeheartedly with what Cameron said, and add that I hope that social media can also, in particular, help boost fields like mycology that have been traditionally understudied. You know, like there are no departments of mycology, even though there's, you know, many more species of fungi than there are plants, for example. But yeah, I think that social media could be a really great way to help people learn that, you know, there's so much out there to learn that we're not even aware of, in addition to the points about accessibility, which I really, really want to drive home, that social media can really, you know, reach a lot of people, get a lot out there, and be really, really useful for a lot of people.
So Kat, you want to add an extra M in PMB?
I would.
I also agree with both of the other panelists. I do think it is. I do hope that it allows people who have maybe normally not had as much access to learning about science and practicing science, or not had the visibility, or have suffered through certain things, you know, within our profession, to have a platform to actually kind of be recognized and have kind of a place that, within it, the proper, you know, just be sharing it as much as everybody else does, right? I think we're learning a lot about ways of communicating online now, because of the restrictions of the pandemic, which might make, you know, conferences more accessible, as Cameron was saying earlier, which I think would be great. It would be great to be able to have more people involved, reduce the cost, and maybe have more creative ways of communicating.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, the virtual audience that we don't see, but also panelists, Cameron, Kat, and Arash. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and taking the time to be with us. I also want to take one moment to thank the staff that actually helped make this live feed happen. That would be Cassie Darling, David Tozer, and Studi Ghoshal. We really appreciate your support. And you can find this recording on YouTube. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful and enjoyable evening.
Okay. Thank you, Karine. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karine.